the community in which I grew up, it was culturally unacceptable to hand over something to another person using the left hand. Another issue that was unacceptable was for a man or a male to put on braided hair. And we normally refer to those people as Rasta men. And so being a Rasta man in the culture in which I grew up was not acceptable. Another thing that was not acceptable was for a woman to enter a house that was designated for men. There were certain houses that were designated for men, and women were not supposed to enter those houses. Women at a point in time would menstruate, and going to those houses was an abomination. So there were houses that were referred to as women houses, and others that were referred to as men houses. And the men could go to the houses designated for the women, but the women were not supposed to enter the houses that were designated for the men. Assuming that it was in this culture that the Bible was written, it was likely that God would tell the people not to use the left hand to hand over something to another person, or not to do gestures using the left hand, especially when talking to the elderly. He would also probably have said that men should not put on braided hair. And another thing that he is likely to have said was that women were to keep to the houses designated for them and not to go to the houses designated for men. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is this: assuming that the Bible was written based on such a culture, would it be right, legitimate, authentic for us to take those prohibitions and send them everywhere? I mean, go everywhere and say that it is not right, it is unchristian, it is unbiblical to use the left hand to hand something over to another person? Would it be legitimate to say that women are not supposed to go to certain houses? What if the culture has nothing like houses designated for men and houses designated for women? Again, would it have been proper to say that men are not supposed to put on braided hair because God had told my people not to do so? I'm trying to draw your attention to the cultural dimension of the Bible, and for that matter, biblical interpretation. In this video, we will be looking at how to deal with such cultural issues. If you have not already subscribed, this is the channel, Biblical Research and Innovation Network for Africa, Brain for Africa or BrainFA. I do encourage you to subscribe to the channel and enjoy the videos that we have posted and those that we will be posting. In dealing with the issues that I have raised, it is crucial for us to appreciate the fact that the Bible emerged from a particular culture. And so some of the things that we find in the Bible might be culturally bound, and they may not cut across all cultures. It is likely that in your culture, some of the things that I've mentioned do not apply. They are not abominations. They are not prohibitions. You can use the left hand to give something to somebody. There is nothing like houses designated for men and those designated for women, and so you can go everywhere. And there is also nothing wrong with a man putting on braided hair. Even if your culture is the same as the culture in which I grew up, it is undeniable that some cultures do not prohibit some of those things that I have mentioned. And so those prohibitions are not universal. How do we deal with such issues in the Bible? When such issues are presented in the Bible, there are two things that we need to distinguish between. The first one is the act or the practice, the actual thing that we are told to do or we are told not to do. For example, in Jonah chapter 3 verse 8, we are told that the leader asked the people to put on sackcloth. So putting on the sackcloth is the act or the practice. In the examples that I mentioned, the use of the left hand to hand something over to another person is the practice that is prohibited. Then the putting on of braided hair is the practice that is not allowed, as well as women entering houses designated for men. These are the practices. Now, having seen the practice, the second thing that we need to look at, which is more critical and very important, has to do with the principle, the timeless truth about the whole issue. What principle is it teaching us, or what message does it carry? In the case of my people not allowing the use of the left hand to hand over something to another person, it is emerging from the idea that the left hand is not equal to the right one, in the sense that the right one is considered to be clean, the right one is considered to be more weighty than the left. And the left, you see, is used for cleaning certain areas and for cleaning certain things, and so in a way it is considered as not clean. And so to use the left hand to even point to somebody means that you are trying to say that the person is unclean. So it has to do with cleanliness. It is like considering one as clean and the other as unclean, as we have clean animals and unclean animals in the Bible. In the case of men not allowed to put on the braided hair, in most cultures, especially in Africa, we find men with that kind of hair associated with certain lifestyles, such as smoking, drinking, theft, and so on and so forth. So the experience of the people have led them to classify such people as bad ones. And so a Christian would not normally encourage the son to put on braided hair. It is even difficult for some of these people to find job, and in some cases it creates some challenges as they fight for their rights. Now, the other one, which is the women not allowed to enter the houses designated for the men, has to do with, you see, the woman may be in her menstrual flow, and in those days, in the olden days, a lot of these men had their own means and ways. By that I mean they associated themselves with deities, and these deities gave them certain substances that protected them. And so when the woman entered that house, there was the possibility of getting into contact with some of these items and making them unclean. And so, as far as I know or have been told, these are the reasons. You might have other reasons which are also legitimate. Yes, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that there were some reasons for making these practices abomination in such societies. Taking the biblical example, that is Jonah chapter 3 verse 8, putting on sackcloth meant that the people were remorseful. They were sad. They had repented of their sins. And so, if you know the story, they were trying to plead that God should forgive them of their sins. What then are the principles? The principles are, in your interaction with people, you need to be respectful. So the left hand issue has to do with being respectful when interacting with others, especially the elderly. Then, in the case of, in quote, the Rasta kind of life, the principle is that Christians should put on the lifestyle that befits them as people who have been called by God. So if in that society, behaving like, in quote, a Rasta man does not speak good about a person, then people would have to move away from such kind of lifestyle. With regards to the issue concerning women not allowed to enter houses designated for men, the principle is that women should respect their husbands. There could be other principles that we could derive, but we can move on with these principles. So the issues are two. We have the practice, the action that is either encouraged or forbidden, and the principle. So having distinguished between the act or the practice and the principle or the message, what one has to do is to find out whether the practice transcends culture, meaning that it is transcultural. It can move from one culture to another. So you take it from my culture to your culture. But now, since we are talking about the Bible, then we mean moving it from the biblical world to our world. If, on the other hand, the practice is culturally bound, then the practice will remain in the biblical world, but the principle will cut across all cultures. So the point is that there are times that both the practice and the principle will be transcultural, move from the biblical world and come to every culture or come to your specific culture. There are times that only the principle or the message will go. But it is important for me to state that at all times, the principle will go to all cultures. So no matter what, whether the practice is following us or the practice is not following us, the principle is always applicable. So no matter the situation, it is important for us to apply the principle. With this, I want us to look at least one biblical passage and see how we may apply this principle to see what we should do in that case. I want us to apply the principle to the issue of braided hair. In Ghana, where I am, and other parts of Africa and other parts of the world, the issue of braided hair is a big issue within the Christian circles. There are pastors who prohibit their members from putting on braided hair based mainly on 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. And so I want us to read what it says there. I'm reading from the King James Version. I will later read from other versions as well. In like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair, or gold, or pearls, or costly array. This is the original King James Version, and I'm reading from the New King James Version as well. In like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair, or gold, or pearls, or costly clothing. There are a number of issues that we may consider from this text, but I want us to consider the issue of braided hair. As I indicated a while ago, some Christian leaders, based on this text, are saying that Christian women cannot put on braided hair. So we want to find out whether the practice of putting on braided hair transcends cultures, or it is culturally bound, or how should we apply it. A background study of the text indicates that there were some women in Ephesus where Timothy was at the time that he received the letter, or at the time that Paul wrote the letter to him. And these women were people who put up certain unchristian behavior, and they were associated with this kind of lifestyle, making their hair braided, then they will put some pearls inside it, as well as decorating it in such a way to attract attention. Some use that to attract men, others to use that to show that they are rich and to blow their own trumpets. And so the braided hair at that time and in that culture was associated with immorality to a great extent. And Paul wanted the Christians, having converted from their pagan religion to Christianity, to live as Christians and not to go back to such kind of lifestyle. And that is why he asked them not to show off through the kind of hair that they put on. So let us now apply the principle. But before we go into the details, let me ask, those things that I mentioned, the use of the left hand in handing over something to another person, a man putting on braided hair, then women entering houses designated for men. Let's assume that I come to your culture. God has already spoken to us and has told us not to do those things. So what God told us is now transferred to your culture, just as we Christians are receiving the message from the biblical culture. So I come to your place and say that you should not use your left hand to hand something over to another person. Whether in your culture it is neutral or not. If I come and force that principle on you, will that be fair? Okay. What if I come and I say that women are not supposed to enter houses designated for men. Whether you have those houses or not, you need to practice it. So I go to a place where they don't even distinguish between which house is for men, which house is for women. Then I go and tell them, no, you have to now appoint certain houses and designate them as houses for men where women cannot enter. Would that be a legitimate and authentic application of the text? Think about it. If I go to a place, for example, maybe Jamaica, and men have put on braided hair, but it has nothing to do with their morality, and I go and say that God told us not to put on braided hair, so we have come, and once you have accepted our religion, you need to cut your braided hair. Would that be biblical? Would that be authentic? Would that message be what God wants us to give to his people? I want you to think about these things. Now, what we need to understand is this. There is nothing inherently immoral about the braided hair. There is nothing inherently immoral about the use of the left hand. There is nothing inherently immoral about women entering certain houses or not entering certain houses. But then in the culture in which I find myself, these things are there. So when God was speaking to us, he wanted us to show respect. He wanted us to obey our husbands. And he said that if I go to another place where it doesn't matter, I don't have to go and force that practice on them. But note that there is a principle to carry across. And so it is that principle which is important. The translator may help the situation by discovering the principle and then in his or her translation put something there, a practice there, which carries the same message as the one in the biblical text. Some translations have done that. They have used certain expressions to ensure that the same principle goes through to other cultures or to their own cultures, but the practice they consider as culturally bound, and so might remain in the biblical culture. Now let me ask, before I read some of these versions, in some cultures, braided hair symbolizes modesty. It symbolizes humility. It symbolizes good lifestyle. So are we saying that in those societies too, we should go and preach that Christians should not put on braided hair? No. In that culture, the meaning is not the same as what it meant in the culture in which Timothy lived, or in the culture that Paul addressed. They mean two different things in the two different cultures. And as I said earlier, there is nothing inherently evil about the braided hair. Now let us see how some translations have put it. The NIV uses elaborate hairstyle. So for the NIV, we cannot tag a particular hairstyle as associated with extravagant living. So the NIV uses a generic expression, that is elaborate hairstyle. I don't think we are expected to understand the elaborate as a wig that is too big. But I believe the term elaborate in this case has to do with something that you have decorated, something that calls attention, something that is expensive. The NLT puts it this way: not draw attention to themselves by the way they fix their hair, not drawing attention to yourself by the way you fix your hair. Again, here it is not a particular hairstyle. Any hair that make people draw attention to themselves fall under this. So it is a generic expression in that case. The Christian Standard Bible also uses the expression elaborate hairstyles. Then we have the Holman Christian Study Bible also using elaborate hairstyles. Contemporary English version says fancy hairdos. Fancy hairdos. Good News Translation says fancy hairstyles. The word fancy in this case has to do with something that is expensive, that is decorative, that is entertaining. These and other similar words may be used to explain the word fancy. However, even though some versions have put it this way, there are a number of versions that use the literal translation, that is braided hair. And so your translation might adopt one of these strategies. Assuming that your translation is literal, you need to do that homework. That is, you need to understand why it was forbidden and see if it applies to your culture. If your translation follows the dynamic equivalent, then it has already done that homework and has put something there for you to know which hairstyle the passage or the text refers to. So this is how we can use the principles that we have studied in this video to explain. A quick recap of what we have said about this text is that the Bible does not prohibit braided hair. It may be prohibited in a particular culture, even today, if it does not represent modesty, if it does not stand for Christian lifestyle, then it is prohibited. But in cultures where it does not connote immorality, or it does not connote anything that is unchristian, it is allowed for Christians to put on braided hair. As I conclude, I want to give a summary of the points that have guided what I've said so far in this video. And the points are coming from Roy B. Zuck. And at the end of the video, you will find the bibliographic information if you want to read further about the principles and know more about what has been said in this video. You can get the book and learn further. There are 5 points that he gives to help readers translate biblical commands from one culture and time to another. And the first one is this: discern as accurate as possible the principle behind the given behavioral command. So he terms the act or the practice as behavior, and the principle he uses the same terminology as I used. Number 2, discern whether the principle is timeless or time-bound. Sometimes the principle may be time-bound, and so it may end at a certain point in time. And we need to distinguish between timeless principle and time-bound principle. So we discern whether the principle is time-bound or timeless. Now he goes on to say that since most of the principles that we find in the Bible are based on God's unchanging nature, we need to take the principles as timeless and transcultural, unless the Bible clearly stipulates that we should do otherwise. So we can say that virtually all the principles are timeless and transcultural, as I hinted earlier. Number 3, if a principle is transcultural, that is, if it is timeless, which, as I've said, in most cases it will be, study the nature of the behavioral application within our culture. So you need to consider what that practice, act, or behavior will represent in your culture. Then you ask the question, will that behavior or practice or act be appropriate for us now, or will it be perceived as outmoded? Will it mean something different in our culture? For example, the wearing of the sackcloth, will it mean the same as it meant for the biblical audience, I mean the first audience, or it will mean something different? If it will mean the same, is it still something that we practice? These are some of the analysis that you do regarding the point 3 that Roy gives. He explains further and says that the criterion for determining whether the practice is appropriate for us now or not is not to conform to the modern cultural practices, but the criterion is whether it adequately and accurately expresses the God-given principle that was intended by the given practice or behavior or act. So we need to take note. We are not saying that you should try to conform to the modern culture, but the question is, when we do exactly what is said in the Bible in terms of what the practice is it going to adequately and accurately capture the message that God was sending across to his people? Number 4, assuming that if we do the same, for example, if we wear the sackcloth, if we do the holy kiss in Romans 16:16, for instance, and it is going to mean something different. The sackcloth will mean something different in our culture. The holy case will mean something different in our culture. It is immoral. Then we need to change the practice. We need to change the act. We need to change the behavior and look for a culturally appropriate behavior that will carry the same message, that will send the same message or principle across to our people. So if it is the holy case, what is the rationale behind? What is the principle? What is the message? Assuming that the message is that when you meet, you should practice the holy kissing in order to show love to one another and to express the feeling that you are happy that you have met again, to fellowship. Then in some cultures, a hug will be more appropriate. In some cultures too, a handshake will be more appropriate. So if the holy kissing, the act of kissing, is problematic, which I know is the case in most of our cultures, then something else has to be done to carry the same information or to send the same message across. Therefore, we are saying that the act, the behavior, the practice may change, but the change should still lead to sending out the same message to the people. So if I go back to the examples that I started with, it will happen that the act of giving something to another person using the left hand does not mean anything. It is neutral in another person's culture. But then to stand akimbo whilst talking to somebody or whilst handing something over to another person is what shows disrespect. So the use of the left hand then becomes standing akimbo. It is the same message but different acts. In the case of, in quote, Rastafarian lifestyle, it will happen that in a particular society, the pastor has braided hair, but he is not a bad person. The organist, the same. The choir master, the same. The senior presbyter or something, the same. So in that culture, there is no connection between, in quote, Rastafarian lifestyle and bad behavior. That kind of lifestyle or putting on the braided hair is neutral in that culture. And then it will happen that in that culture, if you shave everything or if you shave as I have shaved, then people will see you and know that you are immoral or you put up deviant behavior. So in that case, putting on the braided hair becomes either the way I've shaved my hair or maybe shaving everything. So let's take note that as for the principle, it is likely to cut across all cultures, but the practice may change from culture to culture. Roy ends by saying, that is number 5, that if after a careful study, the nature of the biblical principle and its attendant command remain in question, apply the biblical principle of humility. So he is also encouraging us to be humble enough as we go about deciding what to do in such cases. So humility is also very important. We shouldn't do things because we want to make name for ourselves. And of course, this means that we have to also do it prayerfully and be led by the Holy Spirit. That principle is also powerful and very relevant. I'm hopeful that you have learned something to apply. There are other videos to come on some of these issues. And in those videos, I'll pick particular text and apply this principle for us to see how it will go. God richly bless you. Bye for now.